Welcome to a re-recording of a session that we ran with the Salesforce team at Trailhead DX 2019. We ran two sessions actually of this one of building a progressive web application on Commerce Cloud featuring Mobify. So this was a session that usually is prepended with forward-looking statements. This re-recording is meant for internal audiences at Mobify and Salesforce. So we're not going to focus on some, but basically, do not make any buying decisions on this presentation is the general gist of this slide. I originally co-presented this with Holger Nesman, who is part of the customer success group and a technical director. I'm Drew, a VP product at Mobify, and we were invited to talk about this with Holger as part of looking at progressive web apps and how to implement them. So agenda-wise, I will probably be a bit light on a couple sections because those are where the Salesforce team were intrinsic in presenting material, but I will cover a subsection of what are progressive web apps. I'll cover very lightly what are multi-page PWAs, since that was mainly on the Salesforce side, and then I'll be going in depth into what are single-page PWAs and getting into how we can create applicant experiences using a headless architecture, using the Commerce Cloud APIs with our front end as a service. So overall, we started this with a bit of a story where as someone looking to attend the Salesforce conference, attempting to purchase various travel options via plane and trains to get all the way to the Trailhead conference, but going offline because of subpar network connections on the train. And how that compares to what we expect now to be modern experiences running on various phones, like on the right, where you can still have great experiences shopping offline and shopping in more app-like environments. Where in this case, we're looking at George.com, which is a current Salesforce customer, where they built their own progressive web app, and also LANCOME USA, which is a Mobify and Salesforce customer, where they've launched a progressive web app on top of Mobify's front end as a service. So why are progressive web apps popular now? For Mobify, we always cite that you can always engage your shopper wherever they are. So whether that is in a native app, where it's good for frequent loyal shoppers, and it's good for complementing in-store unique brand experiences, to accelerate mobile pages, which are great for addressing shoppers coming in from the organic acquisition channels, and just improving the search experience by loading pages quickly, to progressive web apps, which is probably the newest set of technologies here, where we get to impact the widest range of shoppers and make the biggest impact of brand experience, where we're looking to combine the reach of the web with the 5 billion devices that are connected to the web now, with the level of engagement of what would have been equivalent to a native app if you were to build one yourself. So who can we reach with PWAs? So generally, with progressive web apps, they are indexable. So basically, anyone that can access a search engine like Google can arrive on your PWA, can really interact with your PWA. These are based on standards, so they work on any device that can show websites. Generally, they're based on web technologies. They're accessible in that they can be delivered in various formats, and they're fresh in that they're always up to date. You don't have to download a new version of the native app to get the latest functionality. Just by virtue of being based on the web, you always get the latest version. So the Salesforce team described this as web apps on steroids. Basically, they're meant to be progressive, where your experience using a progressive app improves if your browser or your bot can handle it. Otherwise, you still get a great experience. It's fast because we're looking at implementing advanced caching and performance strategies. It is re-engaging because you can install it on your homepage to experience it like a full-on native app, and with elements such as notifications that usually are in the domain of just native apps. And finally, it's safe in that it uses secure sites only, which is visible to the user, and it's generally sandboxed to use the same protection that we already have on the web based on browsers trying to act in the best interest of their users, in this case, shoppers. So why PWs are important? Over the last 2 years at Mobify, we've had the luxury of running a bunch of A/B tests where we go compare progressive web app directly to the previous sites, usually built-in responsive techniques. And what we have seen is, as we run these statistically relevant A/B tests, is that we always see anywhere from 23 to 40% boost in mobile revenue over the full journey user journey of a mobile PWA. And that's a fairly scientific way of showing that, hey, you will make a lot more money as a business if you are to adopt the latest web technologies and PWAs. So that's enough rationale a lot of times to go explore whether to go down a project to go implement the PWA itself. When we look at how this applies to the Salesforce Commerce Platform, we are starting to look at 3 specific options of how to implement the PWA. And this is really generally what we're looking at for this presentation. To show how you can use a commerce-led experience to implement the PWA, in which case we are essentially adding PWA on top of a site genesis or SFRA based storefront. You can also look at doing this on top of a CMS if you're using the as a content management system as the system that is delivering the experience to the shopper. In our case, what Mobify will be talking about is our API first experience, which is using open commerce APIs from Commerce Cloud to integrate in and deliver a separate front-end experience using our front-end as a service. So from a technical introduction point of view, keeping in mind that this presentation is geared towards more of a developer audience, what are PWAs? So a PWA itself is composed of 3 specific elements. One is a service worker, which is really a special worker script that, that is in the background of your browser. This is scoped to your specific domain, and it's meant to handle different browser events in the background. So it is essentially a piece of middleware that sits running in the background of your browser. It also is based on a web manifest, which really defines the look and feel of an app. So if you decide to add this PWA to your home screen, it will define what colors and icons to use and so on. And finally, SSL, the only way you get a progressive web is if you use a fully secure site. So that's why HTTPS is mandatory in this case. So what a service worker is based on this animation is when we come in and try to request a page, that request is passed through a service worker, which will let you intercept and modify a given request as needed. So that's good in that you can use this to do things such as caching specific data, so you don't have to go back and get the data and deliver it back to the shopper, so you get a much faster experience, for example. And that's one of the options that a service worker provides. What you can do with this is you can either implement a progressive web app in one of 2 ways. One is a multi-page progressive web app, and one is a single-page progressive web app. So a multi-page progressive web basically is where a shopper comes into a given site. That site on first load will install the service worker, and that service worker will be active in that it's intercepting any requests, so that if you were to request the HTML of the page or assets such as images on the page, the browser would render at first a blank page, then render elements of the page, and if you were to interact with that one and move on to the next page or during that next request would go be intercepted again by the service worker, giving us the ability to serve up cache content, and then we would rerun the full page again, but we may be able to render it a bit faster because some of the content might have been cached already within the service worker. A single page progressive web is a slightly different model. This is usually combining a single page application with a progressive web app and using something called an app shell. So in this case, when you hit a page for the first time, again, the service worker will install as usual, and that will start intercepting any request. In this case, because it's a single page application, we also install the service worker and the caching there, what we call an app shell, which is really usually kind of the surrounding construct of the application, so the header, the footer, and so on. As we interact with the application this time, it is not trying to re-render the full page again, but it is because it's a single page app, we're trying to re-render just the bits that change. But the request to go access additional data and assets to go update the portion of the page that changes still runs through the service worker, so we still get the ability to cache things and intercept things, so that we still, again, get a more app-like experience. So either way, a service worker is active, but you have really 2 different ways of building a progressive web app. So the more advanced flow, what happens is if we use an app shell as we hit the first page and go to the women's category on a given e-commerce site, that request is routed through the service worker. The service worker itself knows that, hey, I already have the header and the footer cached as part of the app shell as part of a previous request, so I can just render those ones up front. And then I can go start rendering the rest of the application by going to access the backend and then caching a bunch of the data as needed. So to visualize this, if we use our LANCOME example, what happens when we first get into the service worker is we will go load and cache the app shell. So in this case, usually the header content and some of the other assets around what a blank application would look like. This would be very similar if you were to open up, say, your Facebook application on your phone, in which case then you would already usually have the app shell of Facebook there whenever you load the app, and then the rest of the app kind of fills in afterwards. So you see in this case, we start loading up the rest of the rest of the website. We start getting data from the underlying e-commerce system. We have content placeholders to prevent the page from shifting, the layout from shifting, and then we render all the content as we get data coming back from the Commerce Cloud system. So this app shell is sexually persistent. It's always there, and it will be the first thing that shows up for you as you interact with the progressive web app. So to see it in action, Holger basically had a section where he does a live demo of this one. I'm going to skip that because that is something that is specific to site Genesis and not something Mobify will be running here. But he definitely talked about having live demo issues because he decided to take that risk. So basically, he would go through an exercise where he would be able to show the difference of our progressive web app in a multi-page PW environment, where he would be comparing on the left a standard SFRI site, on the right a SFRI site with the service worker installed. So in this head-to-head example, you'll see that on the right-hand side with the progressive web app, the flow through the system to go through all the pages is much faster with the progressive web app because we are able to use the service worker to cache a lot more content. So you'll see as we do this head-to-head comparison on the SFRA based site, we'll get through a bunch of this a lot faster as we complete this kind of user flow. So you'll see a lot of the data is cached already. We don't have to refetch a lot of data, so that's why the page tends to render a bit faster. And that's why, from an admin point of view, if you were to try to load the data, you can try to load it from cache or override that, so you can always see the freshest data as a kind of an SFRA administrator. So that's kind of the demo of how the standard SFRA PW would work using a plugin that the Salesforce team has provided as a link cartridge to install. So with this plugin, you would just install the service worker. It is pre-configured to cache the right content based on the service worker, and then it will let you score certain whiteout scores based on having that service worker in place. So this brings us to really spectrum of what you can do with progressive web app. So a progressive web app isn't just an on-off type of thing. It really is a spectrum of capabilities. So you could choose to implement as much of a PW as you want or as little as you want. And so this comes from Jason Grigsby, where he presented a spectrum of a couple categories. In our case, we could say, hey, if you want this to feel like an app, you could go with just looking at caching data and making it fast. Or you could look at building a full app shell model like we have seen on the single page PWA to provide more of an app-like experience. We could decide for instant discovery to allow add to home screen with the web manifest and to look at how to make it a bit more native app, or we could go all the way and say, hey, let's go wrap this in a native app wrapper so we can put it in the various app stores. For offline, we could look at just caching just an offline page and saying, hey, you're offline. Or we could look at on the full end of the spectrum, downloading the entire catalog offline so you could serve it up even if you're off the network. For things like engagement, you could look at adding personalized push integrations all the way through, or just keep it as just a concept to look at later. And beyond PWAs, you could look at leveraging as many of the various APIs that let you interact with the device functionality. So for example, you could add in some basic functionality for using a barcode scanner, or you could use a bunch of camera access to go layer on a bunch of augmented reality capabilities, depending on how far you want to take it. So as an example, this is kind of a comparison of LANCOME and Sephora. One of these is a native app, one of these is a progressive web app. And for the most part, you can't really tell. They offer a lot of the same functionality, with me being a wonderful model, where I can go into the experience and try on virtually a bunch of lipstick colors via the augmented reality capabilities, and also through a very app-like flow through the system. So you'll see that really you can achieve both things, whether you're on a native app or whether you're on your progressive web app. The main difference there, as you look at this comparison, is the left is a PWA, the right is a native app. If you are trying to engage, give a shopper on this one to hit the experience on the left, you can come in through any website, any link, any social link, any Google search link, and you'll be mainly downloading a small website around 1.8 megabytes. If you were to want to try out the Sephora experience, you have to go through the friction of the App Store, install a couple things, download 110 megabytes, and you're having to go through a couple extra steps to go experience this brand. So generally, these are both valid things to present to your shoppers, but you want to be able to give as good an experience to you and your web-based shoppers on the left-hand side, and that's what a PW is now able to allow your shoppers to experience. So at Mobify, we have worked on progressive web apps for over 2 years, of which we have a lot of Salesforce Commerce Cloud customers, such as logos here. And we originally started this journey because we wanted to address really the mobile moments problem, where a lot of our shoppers today are in a partial state of attention. And what we have done when looking at this research is noticing that the attention span of a human is at 8.25 seconds and falling. And you compare that to a goldfish has a 9-second attention span. So we really just can't pay attention even to the extent that a goldfish can. So we focus this on making sure every millisecond counts. If we're really looking at 8.25 seconds to leave an impression on a given shopper, we really need to focus on making that experience highly performant. So there's a lot of data out there that says, oh, what happened if your page is slow to load, and if it is not responsive to my interactions. And generally, a lot of shoppers just generally won't return because of how poorly performing experience it is. So one thing that we tend to focus on is Jacob's Law, which basically in this case is your shoppers will spend most of their time on other apps. This means your users will prefer your e-commerce website to work in the same way that their other apps do, and they already know. So if you think about your mobile device, your 80% of your time will be spent in your top 5 native apps. So your Instagrams, your Facebooks, your Messenger apps, and so on. And those have a very slick user experience. They feel like an app, they're fluid, they're responsive, they're highly performant. If you compare that to your current website on a mobile browser, it's a very, very different experience. And that is impacting how shoppers perceive the experience, and therefore how willing they are to engage with your site, given that they're used to a much more elevated experience given the top 5 apps that they tend to interact with. So from a Mobify perspective, what we do is we focus on 3 elements to delivering what app-like experience on the web. We combine the best practices of responsive design, so we can go from a mobile to tablet to desktop design in a single code base, with everything that a service worker offers from offline and caching and kind of a service worker capability, to also looking at single page apps and using single page app technology to really promote instant page transitions and really fast load times. So we tend to think about this around how customers think about user experience, which in this case is the site easy to use and does it load quickly? And it's a combination of these 2 factors which measure really what is a good user experience. So in our case, we will look at usability benchmarks like how many steps there are in checkout, how many forms you have to fill out, along with technical metrics like page load speed and time to interactive. So we combine user experience, we combine technical performance, we end up with a metric called time to task completion. So time to task completion is really, as an example, a combination of both technical elements and usability elements, where we can try to make the page load fast via something like AMP. We then will try to make sure the user experience is intuitive to a given shopper, and they can get through a lot of the experience by looking at things like filtering and search and focus areas, and then using things like the progressive web app and single page app to go load subsequent pages faster, and then adding in new APIs to go encourage one-tap payment methods. This example of how we can apply a bunch of different techniques to go collapse the amount of time it takes to complete core journeys. And so what we found that is, as we roll out progressive web apps, we can deeply improve the time to complete certain tasks, such as findability, by up to 170%, and for checkout and completing checkout, anywhere from 24% faster than a non-PWA site. So the best way to show this off is usually a side-to-side comparison. So in this case, we're going to take a look at Paula's Choice, which is a wonderful example of what you would expect. So on the left is the responsive site that Paula's Choice originally started with, and the right is the progressive web that we built on top of Commerce Cloud. And you'll see that in this case, to go through a core shopper journey of finding a product and adding it to your bag, you'll see that there is a bit of difference. On the right-hand side, you'll see that as we navigate through, we have the app shell model. We're not re-rendering the whole page. You'll see that loading a lot of the content and rendering parts of the page that change are a lot more intuitive. So we can complete a core journey in about 20 seconds. You'll notice on the non-PWA sites, this would take, about 30 seconds. So we're looking at, about a 33% improvement to time to task completion. So that's a good example visually of what that looks like. If you look at the resulting metrics, we look at Paula's choice, again, a joint customer of Salesforce and Mobify. The improvement in time to task completion with the PWA will result in about a 40% boost in revenue per user for mobile, a 46% boost in user conversion rate, and again, a bunch of reductions in the time to task completion for some of these core flows. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we implemented this. And then again, as a reminder, we went with an API first approach where we wanted to go pursue a headless architecture and have a separate front end call into the Commerce Cloud APIs so that we can have a clean separation of front end and back end. So this is something called headless commerce. This itself is an architecture that isn't really new. We've been talking about this for a couple of years. And generally, when you think about how to deploy an e-commerce site, you're looking at either a commerce-led experience where the commerce platform is driving the glass and delivering the experience to the given shopper. And that's usually the default mode of most e-commerce sites that have been deployed in the past. In the last couple of years, we've been seeing more of the experience-led approach where you'll take either a digital experience platform or a web CMS and use that as the head to a headless commerce system so that the web CMS is delivering an experience and then it's integrating into the commerce engine itself to go access functionality. The emerging architecture that we're seeing to be more popular now is the API-oriented approach, where you'll essentially be standing up your commerce engine and any other systems side by side. So usually in this case, commerce and content systems, and they will be exposing APIs out to build a front end against. So in this case, usually you would be building a custom front end against these two API-driven systems. But a custom headless front end is fairly complex to build, and there's a lot of considerations to have if you're going to go down this route. And so this is what we talk about with a lot of our clients is if you were to go down the custom front end route, you'd be looking at maintaining and synchronizing a bunch of different code bases, one for each type of technology, PWAs here, AMP here, data apps here, and so on. Each of these custom builds will have its own custom hosting environment and DevOps practices, which is going to be a significant investment. These touch points will have duplicate integrations as new touch points emerge in the future, and we're going to start seeing a lot of them in the future. You'll be exploring these and building them from scratch. And then you still need to level up your skills in your team of how to build with next generation technologies like PWAs, which can be complicated. So what we're trying to position is, hey, you can start with a front end as a service like Mobify so that you can have one place to start all this and have a single code base and a single application runtime to deliver all these experiences on top of kind of an API-led model where, again, we're accessing Commerce Cloud APIs and accessing content APIs that deliver a modern experience. So our goal for doing this is to unlock organizational performance. In our case, we tend to cite this report from the DORA group, the State of DevOps 2018, where we compare elite teams to kind of low-performing teams, and where elite teams are more likely to exceed their organizational goals by a 1.53 factor. And what's interesting about this one is if you think about the front-end perspective, elite teams tend to deploy code more frequently, about 46 times more frequently, and they have lead time that is about 2,556 times faster than low-performing teams, and lead time being, in this case, from the time you commit code to the time it ends up in production. And so part of headless commerce is meant to separate out front-end concerns from back-end so that if you need to get front-end changes out the door quickly, you're only dealing with the front-end experience and not like the entire application, so that you should be able to deploy front-end changes as frequently as possible. So we do this by providing front-end teams a single set of tools to build, test, and deploy these experiences. So you end up with a set of SDKs so you could use to build PWAs and AMP and so on. And you could do this as a single code base. We also provide what we call a modern web development environment where a lot of teams just want to build with modern web technologies. So you are no longer interested in using J2EE and JSPs and .NET and really back-end programming languages and frameworks to build front ends anymore. So a lot of teams want to use popular front-end libraries like React and frameworks like Node and use the modern ES6 JavaScript standard, along with known open source tools like Webpack and Workbox for service workers to build their application. So you can imagine in this world, you would generate a new starter project with a performance optimized scaffold. You get started with NPM, such as installing our SDK dependencies. You would develop and test locally using really a standard Node.js environment. You can use any IDE of your choice. You don't have to use a specific one. When you're happy, you push all this to source control, and you have a single code base for all these front-end experiences. So the important part about this one is if you're building a single page PWA, is to also consider a server-side rendering. And this is where, in our case, a single page app generally is meant to execute client-side, but that has a bunch of implications where performance and SEO tend to suffer in that type of environment. So in our case, we added in a bunch of server-side rendering to our lifecycle such that as you first hit a given e-commerce site, we will deliver you from cache a bunch of rendered server-side content, which generally will be a bunch of unpersonalized HTML, so your standard homepage and so on. They will then go into a hibernation phase where the PWA starts booting up on the client side, and in which case we start layering on top of that base unpersonalized experience a bunch of the personalized elements. So whether that's you're logged in, whether you have 3 items in your cart, whether there's certain inventory levels for the store that's closest to you. That's how we balance out the best way to serve up content and cache content easily and quickly, with layering on a very personalized experience that will be a bit more engaging for you. So we do this via an application delivery network. This is where we're starting to explore really what if environments and deployments were cheap? What if you can stand up a new environment, whether it's dev, staging, production, in a matter of minutes? And what if your deployments took just seconds to do? How would that change your development process? Where in the past you would need to spend days planning out how to get a new environment up and running. These environments themselves are meant to be cheap. They're auto scalings. They're all production grade. They're meant to be immutable, which is an important concept, so that you're trying to make sure you don't accidentally change any of the elements of a deployment at a given time. And these are all based on serverless microservices and infrastructure as code, so that we can drive a lot of the server-side and client-side rendering and take care of a lot of the auto scaling, so that your team doesn't have to worry about how to keep this thing up and running and how to make sure you can scale it up to go meet your holiday traffic as you go forward. So we kind of switched there from, you now have a single code base to drive your experiences. You have an application delivery network, which will be calling into the Salesforce Commerce Cloud system via APIs. And you have kind of a base progressive web app, again, on that spectrum of what you could accomplish. Where we go next is starting to reimagine what you could do with the web and what other advanced PWA functionality you could take advantage of. So this comes from a site called What Web Can Do. Basically, it highlights a bunch of areas where progressive web apps now have access to a lot of the functionality that's been traditionally in the domain of native apps. So in this case, you can see here, there's not that many red X's anymore. And the red X's that do exist on the page organically are in progress, in which case there is a bunch of new standards and capabilities that have been proposed as part of the web standards process, so that in the near future, all these will be checkboxes such that your PWA will have basically the equivalent functionality to any native app out there. So let's explore what some of these sections could mean. I'll start with advanced app-like features for things like push notifications. So you'll see here on these screenshots your ability to, via the web, go promote the fact that you can subscribe to web push notifications. And you could just use this as blanket push notifications where you can go message any anonymous subscriber, or you could use this to be more trigger-based and personalized, where you can say, hey, after 30 minutes on the right-hand side, you could come back and send someone an abandoned cart notification because they actually left something in your cart and you want them to re-engage with that. You can imagine this same push notification capability being used for things like back and stock notifications, shipping notifications, and this is a way to engage shoppers, especially ones who are a bit more privacy savvy and don't want to give up your email address and so on, to receive other types of communication channels. The next one is really about a bunch of other advanced app-like features. So with progressive web apps, you can actually add your PWA to a home screen. And so if you look at the example on the left, we are adding LANCOME to the home screen. We launch it in full screen mode. So now in this case, it looks like an app. It doesn't look like it's in a browser. And we have essentially the ability to launch a more immersive app-like experience via the add to home screen functionality. You also could pair that with things like payment request API, where it's now a standard for any one-tap payment methods. So Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, Google Pay, and so on. They all support a single payment request specification so that you can implement it once. and you get access to things like using the kind of the biometric capabilities to complete a purchase, which really is good because you don't have to fill in 20 different form fields now to complete your checkout process. The other thing that's exciting is the web share API, where you can actually use a native capability to share, say, a given product with your friends based on whether apps you installed on your device. So usually this would be through some clunky web interface, but now you actually can share a product page directly with your friends on Messenger or Instagram and so on based on what else is installed there. You could start looking at more advanced performance aspects. So for example, on the left-hand side is an offline mode capability, where if you do drop off the network, you can still browse products you viewed previously in the given session. And then you can start looking at using more advanced techniques like lazy loading, which are new APIs that came out as part of Chrome 75, as well as looking at adaptive images to factor in things like effective network speed, so that you may want to load smaller images if you are on a slower network, for example. We then can get into more advanced device integration. So if you recall, we showed off some of the augmented reality capabilities from before. You now have full access to things like cameras, so you could do things like barcode scanners. You could still leverage Einstein capability to do visual search based on taking photos or uploading photos. You have the AR that we showed off to try out lipstick colors and try on shoes, for example. You can actually do things via something called WebRTC, so that you can actually have a video chat with, say, a dedicated stylist, so they can recommend to you, certain clothes or certain styles via like you would if you were to chat via FaceTime, for example. And finally, you could also leverage things like taking voice commands and sending that to Einstein, so that you can do hands-free commerce capabilities. So those are just all the emerging use cases for really advanced device integrations. And finally, the one I'm excited the most about is really advanced installation discovery. So in this case, you could take your PWA, and while traditionally it's been done on just the mobile website, you can start thinking about how this could apply to other use cases. Now you can start installing PWAs in a bunch of other environments. So for example, for London Drugs, which is a retailer up in Canada, we've wrapped their PWA inside a native app wrapper, so they can actually be present on the Play Store and the iOS Store. And so that their shoppers, when they're looking for in the App Store, can still access the PWA functionality and get access to their loyalty cards and so on. And that's one way to do it, especially if you're on the iOS ecosystem. Google recently has been promoting their trusted web activities, which is a way to automatically convert your PWA to an Android APK. This is the technique they use for a lot of their kind of light kind of Go apps, where you have Google Maps Go and so on, where it's all built using web technologies and just kind of converted into a simplistic kind of Android application on top. And the one that we've been exploring the most is desktop PWAs on the right. You'll notice here that we're installing and launching from my OS menu here, PWA, in this case, Debenhams, UK retailer. And you'll see that this launches in full screen mode, as you expect from the app. And this is meant to really replace things like Electron, where that's what's being used by apps like Spotify or Slack to build a lot of their native apps using web technologies. So in the future, you can imagine this being used to replace the need to build a lot of native apps on across platforms, or to really leverage a lot more code shared between desktop apps and web apps. And in the future, you could see this as a way to build things like in-store kiosks and the clienteling apps using just web technology, because you get the same kind of immersive native experience as you would, but using just PWA technologies. So in summary, in general, the open web is awesome. It's ready now to reach audiences everywhere, and really we're hitting a new stride of just more and more innovation being released more frequently. So it's good to keep up with that. If you're on the SFRI and Site Genesis side and just want to kind of supercharge your current Excite, you could go look at the Service Worker plugin that the Salesforce team put together. And if you're looking at more rolling at an advanced PWA and looking at cross-device capabilities, then you could come explore with Mobify, a front-end service with a headless architecture, or you could see how you could build this as a complete separate experience across multiple apps. So feel free to reach out to us. We're excited to talk to anyone from the Salesforce team and helping educate additional people on what are PWAs and what is a headless architecture. Thanks a lot.